The cabin was supposed to be a simple retreat, a weekend getaway. My friends and I had been looking forward to it for weeks, hoping for some time away from the grind of daily life. We rented the place from a small family who'd owned it for years, tucked in the woods near a lake, far away from any civilization. The pictures online made it seem like the perfect escape. Quiet, peaceful, surrounded by trees and water. A place where you could disconnect, relax, and just enjoy the solitude. We didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip low, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The cabin was exactly what we imagined, rustic but comfortable. The woods smelled faintly of pine, and the windows offered a stunning view of the lake, which shimmered like glass in the fading light. The air was crisp, cool for late spring, but pleasant enough to sit outside by the fire pit once it got dark. I had never been one to believe in anything supernatural, and the others in our group felt the same. Sure, we'd heard the local stories when we picked up the keys. Tales about strange sounds in the woods, odd occurrences, and rumors of someone disappearing once years ago. But we shrugged them off as just that, stories. The kind of things that get told to tourists to add some mystery. We joked about it, even dared each other to explore the woods at night, but deep down, we didn't expect anything to happen. The first night went by without incident. We spent the evening sitting around the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about nothing important. Eventually, we headed inside to get some sleep. I wasn't tired, but the thought of lying in that cozy cabin with a book seemed better than staying out in the cold. As I lay in bed, I listened to the sounds of the forest. The wind rustling through the trees, the occasional call of an owl, and the soft ripple of the water at the lake's edge. It was all so peaceful, almost too peaceful. I found myself drifting off to sleep, the sense of calm washing over me. That was until I woke up. The clock on the nightstand showed 2:34 a.m. The cabin was pitch black, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the curtains. I shifted in bed, trying to get comfortable again, but then I heard it. A noise, a sound so soft at first, I wasn't sure if I was dreaming. Came from outside the cabin. A faint rustling, like something or someone was moving around. At first, I tried to dismiss it as the wind or some animal. We were in the woods, after all, and there were plenty of creatures out there. But the more I listened, the more it didn't sound like an animal. It wasn't the usual nighttime noises you hear from deer or raccoons. This was deliberate, slow, purposeful, like someone was walking around the perimeter of the cabin, just out of sight. My heart started to race. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound. It seemed to be circling the cabin. Around the back, then the front, then the sides. Every few seconds it paused, and then started again. I wasn't sure what to make of it. My brain tried to reason with itself, telling me it was probably just the wind or some large animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I lay there in the darkness, waiting for the noise to stop, for the rational part of me to take over and calm my nerves. But it didn't stop. The longer it went on, the more uneasy I became. Then I heard it again. A faint thud, like something had bumped against the side of the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I was no longer willing to brush it off as nothing. The rustling grew louder. I knew it was getting closer. The figure, or whatever it was circling the cabin even faster now, like it was drawing nearer. The silence that had once been comforting now felt suffocating. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, like something out there was waiting for me to do something, to make a move. Then I heard something else, a soft scrape against the wood. It was slow, deliberate, like nails on a chalkboard. It sent a chill straight through me, and I froze. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure anyone could hear it, but there was no sound from my friends. They were all still asleep. I stayed in bed for what felt like hours, listening to whatever was moving around outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever it was out there wasn't just some curious animal, but something more, something with intent. Finally, just as I was about to gather the courage to get up and check, I heard a soft voice from the other side of the room. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was enough to make me hold my breath. My mind raced. Who could it be? one of the other guys. But why would they whisper in the middle of the night? The voice sounded different, though. Too low, too eerie. It was almost like it was trying to imitate someone, trying to sound like it belonged. It made me sick to my stomach. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't just lie there and let it continue. I slowly pushed the covers off and slipped out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. I paused for a moment, just listening. The rustling outside had stopped, but the air felt thick, like something was just waiting to happen. I crept toward the window and peeked out, careful not to let the light spill too much outside. I couldn't see anything. The woods were quiet, but there was something unsettling about the stillness. As I stood there, trying to make sense of everything, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the trees, far in the distance. I quickly turned off the flashlight, holding my breath. It was too far to make out, but it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I couldn't stay in there. Whatever was out there, it was real, and it wasn't just going to go away. I had to warn the others. I stepped carefully over the floorboards, trying not to wake anyone, and made my way down the hall toward the others' rooms. The silence was unbearable. My skin prickled as I passed the bathroom, the door slightly ajar. That's when I heard it again. A faint tapping sound, like someone gently knocking on the wall. It came from the direction of the back door, and it sent a wave of nausea through me. I quickly reached the others' rooms and knocked quietly. No one answered. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. Everyone was still sound asleep, just like before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I made my way back to the living room and stood by the door. My hand was on the handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Not yet. I needed to be sure. Slowly, I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear anything. There was nothing. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the night, followed by a low growl, came from outside. Then, everything went completely still. My pulse raced. This wasn't the kind of noise I could explain away. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something bigger. I slowly turned the handle and opened the door a crack. The cold air hit me like a wall, but I didn't move. I listened. There was nothing. The woods were eerily silent, as though everything had suddenly frozen. Then I saw it. Just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the darkness, stood a figure. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and its outline was hard to make out, but it was definitely not human. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My legs were shaking, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for me to make the first move. After what seemed like an eternity, it finally turned and disappeared back into the woods. I waited, frozen, until I was sure it was gone. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't sleep, didn't dare to. By morning, I told everyone what had happened, though none of them believed me at first. They thought I was imagining things, maybe just a product of the isolation and the weird sounds of the woods. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew something had been out there. The rest of the trip was uneventful. We packed up and left early the next morning, and I didn't look back. Even now, whenever I think about that night, I still don't know what that thing was. But I know one thing for sure, we weren't alone out there. Not by a long shot. I woke up to a strange noise coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a branch scraping against the roof, but the sound persisted. Something soft but dragging, almost like feet shuffling slowly across the dirt. I froze, not sure if I had imagined it. The cabin was small, tucked away in the woods, with nothing around for miles except trees, more trees, and the occasional animal trail. I had rented the place on a whim, looking for a quiet weekend away from the chaos of city life. A break, something peaceful. But now, with the noise outside, the isolation felt different. It felt heavier. I got out of bed and pulled on my boots, my eyes glued to the single window in the small room. The pale light of early morning barely cut through the trees, leaving the world outside looking like a dark, shrouded mess. The sounds kept coming, faint but consistent. I slowly moved to the door, unsure if I wanted to see what was out there, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and stepped out onto the small porch. The cold morning air hit me like a slap in the face, and I immediately regretted stepping outside. But there was no turning back now. The sound was closer, like something or someone was dragging itself across the ground. I turned the flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the yard. Nothing. The woods around the cabin were still, no movement except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, something caught my eye near the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, another trick of the dim light. But as I looked closer, I saw it. The figure crouched low to the ground. It looked strange, unnatural. The figure didn't look like a person. It had an odd, contorted shape, almost like it was too thin for its height. The skin was pale, sickly, almost translucent in the dim light. And its head, it was far too large for its body. The eyes, big, round, and wide, shone faintly in the dark, like they were reflecting the light from my flashlight. But the most disturbing part, it didn't move. It just sat there watching me. I stood frozen, too terrified to move, too scared to breathe. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The creature seemed almost peaceful, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to make the first move. I don't know how long we stood like that, just staring at each other. But when I finally blinked, it was gone, vanished. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had no idea what to do. I wanted to run back into the cabin, lock the door, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. I couldn't just ignore it. What the hell was that thing? I stepped closer to the trees, moving slowly, cautiously, shining the flashlight ahead of me. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe it had just been a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. A few yards ahead of me, half hidden in the shadows, it was crouched again, like it had never moved. I almost turned and ran back to the cabin, but something stopped me. Something made me stay, made me look at the creature. It wasn't like I was drawn to it, but I couldn't look away either. My body was frozen in place, and my mind was a mess of confusion and fear. Then the creature made a sound. A low, wet gurgling noise, like it was trying to speak but couldn't. I flinched, the sound sending a wave of dread through me. I raised the flashlight higher, shining it directly at the creature. Its eyes glowed even brighter, reflecting the light, but it still didn't move. It didn't even flinch. I wanted to scream, to shout at it, but the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed, unable to do anything but stare at the thing in front of me. But then, out of nowhere, it moved. Not quickly, not suddenly, but it shifted slightly, as if it had been waiting for me to make a decision. Its long, bony arms stretched out in front of it, dragging itself forward with that same strange, shuffling motion. My heart jumped into my throat as I instinctively took a step back, but I couldn't move fast enough. The creature stopped, turning its head towards me. For a moment, I thought it might lunge, that it might attack me, but it didn't. Instead, it raised one of its arms and pointed towards the cabin. It was a slow, deliberate motion, as if it was trying to tell me something. I couldn't understand what it wanted, what it meant, but that gesture felt like a warning. The flashlight flickered in my hand, and I cursed under my breath, trying to get it to work. I didn't want to look away from the creature, but I had no choice. The light came back on, just in time to see the figure retreat back into the woods. It didn't run. It simply backed away, its slow shuffle disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a few minutes, my body trembling, unsure if I was dreaming or if what I had just seen was real. But then the reality of the situation hit me. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in this cabin, not after that. I didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but I knew I wasn't safe here. I ran back inside, bolting the door behind me and locking every window. I could still hear the dragging sound in the distance, but I didn't dare go outside to check. I stayed inside for the rest of the day, waiting for nightfall to pass, hoping whatever it was would leave and never come back. But as the sun began to set, I heard it again. That same dragging sound, faint but persistent. I sat at the window watching the edge of the woods, waiting for it to appear again. Hours passed, and the sound didn't stop. I was losing my mind, not knowing what to do. I had no cell service, no way of contacting anyone. It was just me, the cabin, and whatever was out there in the dark. By the time midnight came, I knew what I had to do. I had to leave. I wasn't staying in that cabin for another night. I grabbed my pack, my jacket, and made sure everything was locked up tight. I didn't care if it was dangerous or if I was making things worse by leaving. I just needed to get out. I walked through the woods, my heart racing, my eyes darting back and forth, half expecting the creature to appear at any moment. But it didn't. The woods were still unnaturally quiet. No sounds, no movement. I thought I was safe. I thought I was free. But then I saw it. In the distance, just at the edge of the woods, I saw the creature again. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, watching me. I didn't stop to look any longer. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not looking back once. My breath was coming in short, panicked gasps, and my legs were burning from the effort, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, and by then, the sun was starting to rise. I kept walking until I found a place with a payphone, where I finally called a ride to come pick me up. I didn't want to go back to the cabin, not ever. I didn't care if the creature was real or if it was just my imagination. I left that town behind, and I didn't look back. The last thing I remember as I drove away was the feeling of being watched, the sense that whatever it was, whatever I had seen, was still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Just me, the cabin, the woods, and a bit of peace away from the usual noise. I had rented a small, remote cabin tucked away deep in the forest, far from any town or civilization. No distractions. The perfect getaway. The kind of place you see in magazines. Wooden, rustic, with a stone fireplace and big windows that look out onto nothing but trees and sky. I thought it would be quiet. I thought I would be alone. But I wasn't. Not truly. The cabin itself looked like it had been there for decades, maybe even longer. It had an old charm to it that you couldn't fake, even if you wanted to. The wood smelled of earth and pine, and the creaky floors gave it a warmth that made it feel like it had a life of its own. A life that was settled, you could say. The moment I walked in, it felt like it had already been waiting for me. A stack of firewood by the hearth, some old books on the shelves, and the cabin was simply there, just waiting. First, it was exactly what I expected. I spent the first evening getting comfortable, unpacking, and making a fire. The sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature dropped fast, typical for a fall evening. By the time I sat down with my cup of coffee, it was pitch black outside, the kind of dark you don't often get in places where streetlights exist. Out here, the darkness was thick, like a blanket you couldn't peel away. But that was okay. I wasn't scared. I was too tired to be scared. But then something happened. A sound. It was subtle at first. The kind of sound you think you might have imagined. Maybe it was a branch cracking or the wind shifting. But it kept going. Quiet rustling. Almost like footsteps in the woods. But not quite. Too soft. Too irregular. I stood up, went to the window, and looked out into the forest. It was completely still. Nothing moved. Not even the trees seemed to be swaying. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my instincts were telling me to be alert. It wasn't an animal. Not like the deer or raccoons I had seen earlier in the day. Felt different. Felt wrong. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was alone in the woods, and silence can make you feel like you're being watched. But then the rustling came again, louder this time, and then the unmistakable sound of something moving quickly through the underbrush. Something large. I grabbed the flashlight I had left on the counter and went to the door. The cool air hit me immediately when I stepped outside, biting at my skin. The woods were just beyond the cabin, and I scanned the tree line with the beam of the flashlight, but saw nothing. Only trees. Just the quiet, empty woods. I stepped out further, my boots crunching on the dry leaves as I made my way toward the edge of the trees. The flashlight flickered in my hand, and I shook it, frustrated with the cheap batteries I had forgotten to replace. I had no choice but to keep walking toward the sound. Maybe I was being foolish, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what was making the noise. If it was a bear or a bobcat, I could at least prepare myself. But I knew in my gut that it wasn't. Then, just as I was about to turn around, I saw something, a shape. At first, I thought it was a tree stump or a fallen log, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately, and that's when I saw it. I froze. There was something crouched between the trees, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. It wasn't quite a person, but it wasn't an animal either. It was hunched, with long limbs and a narrow body that seemed to twist and bend in unnatural ways. Its skin was pale, almost grayish, and it seemed to shimmer slightly in the weak light. The creature had no clothes, just raw skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was the worst part. The eyes were too large, round, and completely black, and its mouth was stretched into a thin, sharp line, though it didn't smile. It looked more hungry. Not hungry in the way you might expect an animal to be, but a deep, primal hunger. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away. The creature didn't move at first, just watching me with those dark, endless eyes. But then it shifted, and I heard its joints crack, like it had been holding itself in that position for too long. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by fear. I could feel the adrenaline flooding my system, the fight or flight instinct kicking in, but my body wasn't responding. I was frozen, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature disappeared into the shadows, vanishing into the trees without a sound. I didn't wait around to find out if it was coming back. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground, my breath ragged in my chest. I reached the cabin and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. I sat there for what felt like hours, just staring at the door, listening to the silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making it hard to think. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every little noise made my heart race, my mind running wild with thoughts of what that thing was. I kept hearing movement outside, the soft rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, but every time I looked out the window, there was nothing there. It was as if the forest itself had become alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The next day, I decided I couldn't just sit around and wait for whatever that creature was to come back. I had to leave. I packed up my things quickly, throwing everything into my bag without much thought. I wanted to get out of there. The sooner, the better. But as I opened the door to leave, I stopped. Something was off. The forest outside was eerily quiet. The birds that had been chirping the day before were gone. There was no rustling in the leaves, no movement in the trees. Nothing. The world felt hollow, like the air itself had been sucked out. I walked carefully to the car, trying not to make any noise, trying not to draw attention to myself. As I started the engine and pulled out of the cabin's driveway, I glanced at the woods one last time. I swear I saw something moving in the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't look back as I drove away. Couldn't. Whatever that creature was, whatever I had seen, I knew I didn't want to find out more. As I drove down the long, winding road, I thought about the night before, about what I had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there watching. I wasn't sure if it was real or if my mind had just snapped from the isolation, but something in the pit of my stomach told me that I had narrowly escaped something much worse than just an animal. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to seem crazy, but I've never gone back to that cabin, and I never will. I don't care how good the getaway looks on a brochure. Some things are better left undisturbed. I know what I saw, and I don't need to see it again. I just hope that whatever it was, it stays where it belongs, in the woods, out of sight and out of mind. I can't explain it. Maybe I never will. But I know one thing for sure. I won't be making the mistake of staying out there again. Not in those woods. Not in that cabin. Never again. The wind was picking up, whistling through the trees outside the cabin as I sat by the fire, the orange glow of the flames dancing on the rough, wooden walls around me. The smell of pine and damp earth drifted through the cracks in the windows, but it wasn't enough to mask the underlying sense of unease that had settled in my gut. It was just me out here, far from the nearest town, in a cabin I'd rented for a few days to get away from everything. Work, people, the noise of the city. I had planned for peace and quiet, but it wasn't quiet. Not really. The isolation was suffocating. The cabin was small, a one-room space with a loft, a stone fireplace, and just enough old, mismatched furniture to make it feel lived in. It was charming in a rustic way, but the uneven floorboards and creaky walls gave the whole place a kind of old, tired feeling. I had barely settled in before I noticed something was off. Maybe it was the silence. No birds, no rustling of animals in the woods, no wind in the trees, just stillness. I told myself it was the season, late fall just before the first snow, and that everything in the forest had gone quiet for the winter. But something about it still didn't sit right. I was on my second night here when it happened. The first night, I had convinced myself it was just my nerves. I'd heard something, footsteps, just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't sound like that. It was too heavy, too deliberate. I got up and looked through the cabin's small window but saw nothing. The night was still. I tried to go back to sleep, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave me. The next evening, I was cooking dinner over the fire. A simple meal, just some canned chili and cornbread, nothing fancy. I was so focused on the pot on the stove that I almost didn't notice the sound at first. It was faint, but unmistakable. A glass bottle clinking against something hard. At first, I thought maybe it was a branch tapping against the window, but it wasn't the wind. It was something else. I stood still, listening. The sound came again. Clink, clink. This time, I was sure it was outside. My heart started beating faster. I stepped away from the stove, grabbed the flashlight that had been resting on the table, and slowly approached the door. When I opened it, there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anything unusual. The wind had picked up again, swirling the dry leaves around the cabin steps. It was empty, yet the glass shard was there, just at the edge of the porch, lying half buried in the dirt. I bent down, squinting to see what it was. It was small, jagged, and shiny, a shard of broken glass. No clue where it came from, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. Who would leave something like that out here? I stood there for a long moment, the flashlight in my hand casting odd shadows on the ground. There was a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I wasn't alone, but I shook it off. It was just my mind playing tricks, nothing more. I picked up the shard, held it in my hand for a moment, and then tossed it aside. No reason to worry, just some random piece of trash left by whoever owned the place before me. The night passed without incident, but the next day, things only got stranger. The wind picked up, blowing colder, and the forest felt unnaturally still. I went for a hike, hoping the exercise would clear my head. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt the same nagging feeling, like I was being watched. It wasn't just the wind or the trees. Something about the place felt wrong. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every shift in the brush, made my heart race a little faster. I came across an old, half-fallen tree, its branches twisted and gnarled, like something straight out of a horror story. As I walked past it, I noticed a small pile of rocks nearby, carefully stacked in a pattern. I knelt down, curious, but something about it made my skin crawl. Who would stack rocks like that out here? Felt intentional, but there was no explanation for it. Just the rocks, and that same uneasy feeling gnawing at me. I headed back to the cabin, not bothering to explore further. When I returned, I noticed something else. The glass shard was gone. I searched the porch, the ground around it, everywhere, but it wasn't there anymore. That's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Whoever or whatever was out there had come close enough to take it. I spent the rest of the day locked inside, the flashlight in one hand, the door bolted shut. But nothing happened. The evening came, and I ate in silence, listening to the wind howl outside. The light from the fire cast dancing shadows against the walls, and I could almost convince myself that nothing was wrong, that I was just overreacting. But I wasn't. That night I heard it again. This time it was more distinct. The sound of glass being scraped against the wood. It wasn't as faint as before. It was louder, more deliberate. I froze, staring at the door. The scraping continued, slow and steady, like someone was methodically dragging something sharp along the wood, trying to make me hear it. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The night air was cold, biting at my skin. But when I stepped outside, there was nothing. Just the forest, dark and still, the trees swaying in the wind. But then, just off to the side of the cabin, I saw something. A figure, just standing there, not moving. I froze. My stomach dropped to my feet, and my breath caught in my throat. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see a vague outline, a person or something like it. A figure standing perfectly still. I couldn't move. My body was frozen with fear. And then, in the quiet, the sound came again. The scraping of glass, this time coming from the side of the cabin where the figure stood. It was too close, too real. I stepped back, trying to keep my breathing steady, my mind racing. The figure didn't move. It didn't even acknowledge my presence. It just stood there, still as death. I knew I had to get inside. I had to lock the door, but my legs felt like stone, unable to move, like I was glued to the spot. And then, as if the figure had read my thoughts, it moved. Not toward me, but to the side. A slow, deliberate walk, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. I don't know what it was. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else entirely. But I knew I wasn't alone. That shard of glass, the scraping sound, the figure, it wasn't random. It was intentional. Someone was out there, and they were watching me. I ran back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me, locking it. The fire still burned, crackling in the hearth. I grabbed the largest knife from the kitchen and sat down on the couch, staring at the door, waiting. But nothing came. No sounds, no scraping, no figure in the shadows. Just the crackle of the fire and the cold, biting air outside. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't want to stick around to find out what would happen next. There were no more glass shards, no more figures, but I didn't trust that place anymore. I drove back to town with my heart still pounding in my chest, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. But there's one thing I've never been able to shake. The feeling that I wasn't alone that night, that someone or something was out there just watching, waiting, and I'll never know who or what it was. It was a cold evening when I arrived at the cabin. The drive had taken longer than expected. The winding road seemed to go on forever, and with each curve, the trees seemed to close in around me. There was something unnerving about the forest at night, especially when you're alone. And as I pulled up to the small cabin tucked away at the edge of the woods, I felt the weight of isolation settle in. I parked my car next to the cabin, the headlights casting long shadows over the weathered wood. The place looked like it had been sitting here for years, untouched by time, or maybe just untouched by people. It was the perfect place to get away from everything, to clear my head. I had planned to spend the weekend here, alone with my thoughts, no distractions. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the car was the silence. It was the kind of silence that felt thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. Not a single rustle from the trees, no distant calls of animals. Nothing, just quiet. I grabbed my bags from the trunk, locked the car, and headed inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. A musty smell hit me, like old wood and damp earth. I flicked on the lights and took in the space. It was small but cozy, enough for one person, maybe two if they didn't mind being cramped. A stone fireplace sat in the center of the room, with a stack of firewood nearby. I set my bags down and started a fire, the crackling sound filling the otherwise quiet cabin. I didn't waste time unpacking. I set up a small camp in the corner with a blanket and some books. My plan was simple: relax, read, maybe go for a hike the next day. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. But as the night wore on, I started to notice things. Small things at first. The wind outside picked up, making the trees sway, their branches scratching against the cabin like they were trying to get in. I could hear the occasional creak of the wooden structure as it settled, which made sense. It was old, but there was something about the way the wind howled that night, something almost restless. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind. I focused on the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. I grabbed a book from the pile beside me and began to read, though my mind wasn't really on the words. My thoughts kept drifting back to the strange feeling that had settled over me, like I wasn't alone. The fire began to die down, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. I grabbed a couple more logs and tossed them into the hearth, watching the flames jump higher. That's when I heard it. A sound. A soft thud from somewhere outside. I froze, holding my breath, listening. There it was again. A thud. Closer this time. I set the book down, my heart beating faster. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I got up slowly and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing, just the forest stretching out as far as I could see, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The sound came again, louder this time. It was almost like someone was walking around outside, but the ground was soft, covered in leaves, so the steps didn't sound like footsteps. More like something or someone was moving through the brush, carefully but deliberately. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. It had to be an animal, maybe a deer or something. The thought of it didn't ease the tightness in my chest. I walked to the door, my hand hovering over the knob. For a moment, I considered stepping outside to see what was going on, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I knew that the last thing I wanted to do right now was wander into the woods in the middle of the night, even if it was just an animal. I turned back to the fire, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, as I had expected. It wasn't a big surprise. The cabin was miles from anything, and the signal rarely reached this far out. I tossed the phone back down on the table and tried to shake off the unease. The sound continued, coming in soft intervals, like a steady rhythm. Thud, pause, thud, pause, thud. It was coming from the back of the cabin now, just beyond the tree line. My nerves were on edge, and the warmth of the fire no longer seemed comforting. Instead, it felt like a barrier, something that kept me safely inside, away from whatever was outside. I thought about calling someone. I considered the idea of driving back into town, but the thought of getting in my car and speeding down the winding road in the dark didn't appeal to me. I decided to wait it out, hoping it was just a passing animal. But the sound kept coming closer now, as though whatever it was had circled around to the side of the cabin. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the back wall of the cabin. It was like a fist had slammed into it, hard enough to rattle the wooden planks. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the back door. Then the noise came again, this time from the side. A bang, followed by scraping, like something was dragging itself across the wall. My pulse was racing, and my mind was spinning. I didn't know what was happening, but I had the overwhelming urge to leave. But I couldn't. The forest outside felt like a prison, and the cabin, though small and isolated, was somehow a refuge. I grabbed my keys and wallet, heading for the door. But as I reached for the knob, something made me stop. It wasn't just the fear. It was the sense that I wasn't alone. The air was heavy, oppressive, like the world had gone still. I turned back toward the fire, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the room. A figure, tall and thin, with long arms that stretched out in an unnatural way. It was standing near the window just inside the cabin, watching me. My heart stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the shadow, but I couldn't move. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I ran to the window, flinging open the curtain to look outside, but there was nothing there. The wind howled again, but this time, it didn't feel like nature. It felt like something else, something watching me. I knew I needed to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. I decided to leave. Now, I grabbed my stuff and ran out the door, my feet pounding against the ground as I sprinted toward my car. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in around me, but I didn't dare look back. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. As I pulled away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was nothing there. No shadow, no figure, no movement. Just the empty darkness of the forest stretching out behind me. The rest of the drive back to town was a blur. My mind kept racing, replaying every moment, every sound, every shadow. But in the end, there was nothing. No explanation, no answers. I never went back to that cabin. I couldn't bring myself to. The memories of that night stayed with me, though. The unease, the shadows, the constant feeling that something was just out of reach. The forest felt too close, the air too thick. I've never been able to shake that feeling. I don't know what was out there, or if it was even real, but something was watching, something that didn't belong. And I'll never forget the terror of feeling like I was being hunted in the very place I thought I'd be safe. The cabin is still there, abandoned, like a forgotten memory, and I hope it stays that way. Some places are better left alone. The cabin I rented was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, just how I wanted it. A few miles up a dirt road from the nearest town, surrounded by trees and with only a thin trail cutting through the forest leading to it. I wanted peace, silence, and the kind of solitude you can't find in a city. The air was fresh, the kind that made your lungs feel full when you breathed. I had planned for a week of quiet, reading books, and just being alone with my thoughts. No distractions, no noise, no people. The first few days were peaceful, the kind of quiet that lets you hear the wind rustling the trees and the occasional squirrel darting across the forest floor. The cabin itself was small but cozy, just one room with a bed, a wood stove, and a small kitchen. There was no TV, no phone signal, and no internet. It was perfect. The weather was typical for this time of year, chilly mornings and warm afternoons. By the evening, the temperature dropped enough to warrant a fire in the stove. I would sit by the fire with a glass of wine and watch the flames flicker, thinking how lucky I was to have stumbled upon such a place. The only sounds at night were the wind, the occasional crack of a branch breaking in the distance, and the distant hoot of an owl. The 5th day in, I decided to take a walk through the woods. It was late afternoon, and the sky was already starting to turn orange with the setting sun. I grabbed my jacket, strapped on my boots, and left the cabin, closing the door behind me. The air felt crisper today, almost like a storm was coming, though the forecast didn't call for any rain. I wandered off the main trail and into a part of the woods I hadn't explored yet. The trees grew thicker here, the underbrush denser, and the ground softer underfoot, as if the area had been untouched for a long time. I noticed the silence was heavier in this part of the forest, more oppressive. It was as though something about the place made it feel different, darker, somehow. After walking for about an hour, I found myself at the edge of a small clearing. The trees around it formed a perfect circle, like a natural amphitheater. There was something strange about this place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The ground was dotted with old logs and patches of thick moss, and in the center of the clearing, there was a large stone. It looked out of place, like it had been placed there deliberately. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the odd feeling in my stomach. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was no logical reason for it. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, or maybe it was the eerie silence. Either way, I turned around to head back to the cabin. As I walked, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest felt different at night. The air was colder, and the shadows deeper. I quickened my pace, eager to get back before it was completely dark. The path seemed to twist and turn more than I remembered, and the trees seemed closer, like they were pressing in on me. It felt as though the woods were alive, watching me. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, just ahead of me, followed by a soft growl. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath. I listened for a moment, but the sound had stopped. My mind raced. Could it be a bear? A wolf? I couldn't see anything through the thick trees. I stood there, still, straining my ears for any further sounds. Then I heard it again. This time, the growl was louder, more distinct. Came from just off the trail to my left. I took a slow, cautious step back, trying not to make a sound. I couldn't see anything in the growing darkness, but I knew something was out there. Something big, something watching me. I slowly pulled out my phone, hoping to get a signal, but of course, nothing. I cursed under my breath, realizing how foolish I was for not bringing a flashlight. The rustling started again, closer this time. I backed up slowly, my eyes darting to the left, where the sound was coming from. I could make out movement in the shadows, something low to the ground, something with an odd, jerky motion. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't walking like any animal I had ever seen before. It was moving strangely, almost like it was dragging itself along the ground. My mind raced through possible explanations. Could it be a wolf with a limp? A wounded animal? But no, the movement didn't match any creature I knew. The growl came again, louder this time, but it wasn't just a growl. It was a mixture of a growl and a whine, a sound that felt wrong. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. It was low to the ground, with a hunched back and twisted legs that bent at unnatural angles. Its fur was matted, patchy, and the color was a sickly grayish-brown. Its face. There was something about its face that made my blood run cold. Its eyes were wide and reflective, glowing in the dim light. Its snout was too long, too thin, and the teeth sharp, jagged, and yellow. The thing didn't look like a dog, but it had the body of one, with a mouth that looked far too big for its face. I froze. My body screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Its eyes locked onto mine, almost as if it was studying me. The air around me felt thick, like it was hard to breathe, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then it moved. Slowly, carefully, it crept towards me, its eyes never leaving mine. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't seem to move. The creature was almost within reach now, its body sliding through the underbrush like something from a nightmare. Finally, I snapped out of my stupor and turned to run, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. The forest felt different now, as though it were working against me. The trees seemed to block my path, the underbrush grabbing at my clothes. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled, my foot catching on a root. I heard the creature behind me, its heavy breathing growing louder, and then that horrible growl again. I ran faster, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. The air burned in my lungs, my legs screamed with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. The growl was right behind me now, and I could hear its claws scraping against the ground, getting closer and closer. I dared not look back, afraid that if I did, it would be the last thing I saw. Finally, I burst into the clearing I had passed through earlier. I didn't stop. I kept running, my heart in my throat, until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I stood there for a moment, listening. I could still hear the creature outside, its growls and scratches against the cabin's wooden walls. It was pacing, circling the cabin, as if waiting for me to make a move. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't just wait for it to break in. I grabbed my pack, stuffing anything I could find into it. My phone, my jacket, a flashlight I had left in the corner. I checked the window, but it was too dark to see anything outside. I couldn't hear the creature anymore, either. For a long time, I sat there in the cabin, the silence pressing in around me. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. The night passed without incident. When morning finally came, I dared peek outside. The creature was gone, but I didn't feel safe. I didn't want to stay another night in that cabin. I packed my things, left the door unlocked, and drove away without a second thought. I never went back to that cabin. Couldn't. The thing I saw out there in the woods, it wasn't a dog. It wasn't anything I could explain. But I know it was real, and I know it's still out there, somewhere in the woods. The night was colder than I'd expected when I first pulled up to the cabin. I'd rented the place for a weekend to get away from everything. Work, the noise of the city, all the constant pressure. Just me, a cabin in the woods, and the quiet. At least that's what I thought I was signing up for. The cabin was old, a little run down, but charming in a rustic way. The kind of place you see in movies, wooden walls, creaky floors, and a stone fireplace. Felt secluded, like no one could reach me for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I didn't even bother checking my phone once I got here. No service anyway, just the way I liked it. I spent the first few hours unpacking and setting up. The sun had already started to dip below the horizon by the time I got the fire going in the hearth. The wind outside howled, making the trees creak and sway in an eerie way. But that wasn't anything new. It's a cabin in the woods, after all. The evening dragged on slowly. I cooked a simple dinner, read a book by the fire, and then decided to step outside to stretch my legs. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear. Stars were scattered across the dark sky like 1,000 tiny diamonds. I wandered around the back of the cabin, taking in the stillness of the woods. The trees were thick here, and the ground was soft beneath my boots. No signs of wildlife, but the occasional rustle of leaves warned me that there were things out there, things I couldn't see. But it wasn't a comforting kind of quiet. It was the type of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. As I made my way around the cabin, something caught my eye, a shape just off in the distance, moving between the trees. It was dark, and the light from the cabin's porch didn't reach far enough to make out details. I squinted, trying to figure out if it was a deer or some other animal, but it didn't move like one. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I hesitated for a moment, then shrugged it off. It was probably just some kind of large animal, bear, maybe. It didn't matter. What mattered was the fact that I was here, alone, and I wasn't going to let my mind start running wild. I went back inside, locked the door, and settled down in front of the fire again. The warmth of the flames and the crackling of the wood did little to ease the sense of unease that had started to creep up on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was an odd smell in the air, something like wet fur and earth, mixed with the scent of pine. I sniffed the air, trying to place it, but couldn't. That's when I heard the first noise. It was a low growl just on the edge of hearing, a sound that I thought was part of the wind at first. But then it came again, closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up and moved cautiously toward the window, peeking out through the blinds. I could see the dark shapes of the trees outside, swaying in the wind, but nothing else seemed out of place. I turned my attention back to the noise, but this time, it was clearer. A series of heavy thuds, like something large and solid was moving through the underbrush. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it moving closer to the cabin. The growls continued, only now they were accompanied by the sound of something dragging across the ground, like claws scraping over bark or stone. My heart started to pound. I had to be imagining this. It was just an animal, probably a bear or something else roaming through the woods. But still, I didn't take any chances. I double-checked the door, making sure it was locked, then grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, just in case. I moved to the back window, positioning myself where I could see a little better. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. It was massive, too large to be any kind of normal animal. It stood on two legs, towering over the brush in front of it. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and the way it moved was unnervingly human-like. But it wasn't human. Its head was shaped like a dog's, but much larger, almost wolf-like. Its ears pricked forward, listening for something. The growls weren't from a bear, not even close. The creature sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring, and I felt its gaze shift toward the cabin. For a moment, everything went still. I don't know why, but I froze, holding my breath. My mind raced. What the hell was that thing? It wasn't something I could recognize. No animal I'd ever seen or heard of. It was as if it didn't belong. Then, the creature turned and moved away, disappearing into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. My legs nearly gave out, but I managed to stay standing, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. It wasn't a bear or even a large wolf. This thing was something else, something I couldn't explain. I sat back down by the fire, trying to collect myself. My head was spinning, but I knew I couldn't leave. I was miles from the nearest town, and whatever that thing was, it wasn't likely to show itself again. Or so I told myself. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Every now and then, I'd hear the occasional rustle of branches, but nothing else. I stayed awake by the fire, keeping the poker close. At some point, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I dozed off, curled up in the chair near the hearth. The flames had died down to embers when I was woken by a noise outside. A soft thudding, followed by the same low growl from before. My heart leaped into my throat as I shot to my feet. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I crept over to the window again, but this time, I didn't dare peek outside. Instead, I stayed low, watching the shadows move outside from between the slats of the blinds. I heard the growling get louder, closer. The thing was circling the cabin. It had come back. I felt a wave of panic, realizing how exposed I was. The cabin, despite being sturdy, felt too fragile in that moment. The wind outside seemed to pick up, and I could hear the thing moving around, its claws scraping against the stone foundation of the cabin. My mind raced with thoughts of how to get out, but I knew it would be useless. I was trapped. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. I didn't know if the thing had left, or if it was waiting for me to make a move. My pulse hammered in my ears. I waited, holding my breath, for what felt like hours. But then, just as I thought I might have a chance to escape, the growl returned, louder, more aggressive. It was coming from right outside the front door. It was close enough that I could hear the steady breathing, the rasp of air being sucked in and out. My blood ran cold. Without thinking, I grabbed the fire poker and held it in front of me, moving slowly toward the door. I had no plan, no strategy, just the raw instinct to survive. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door handle. I never got the chance to open it. The door slammed against the wall with a force that shook the whole cabin. The creature, whatever it was there. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was in the doorway, blocking any way out. The thing let out a deep, rumbling growl, and I was sure I saw its glowing eyes pierce through the darkness. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it backed away. It turned, its massive body disappearing into the night with another sigh that sounded almost human. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran to the back door, fumbled with the lock, and bolted outside, not looking back until I was safely in my car. I didn't return to the cabin after that. I drove straight back into town, terrified to even think about what I had seen. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not at first. Who would believe me? The creature in the woods, the growls, the human-like eyes. It didn't make sense. But I knew what I saw, and I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back there again. It was one of those weekends when you're just looking to escape the city and get some peace and quiet. The kind of weekend where you want nothing more than to sit in a small cabin, read a book, and listen to nothing but the rustle of trees and the occasional bird calling out. So when my friends invited me to join them at a cabin in the middle of nowhere, I was quick to say yes. The place they'd rented was deep in the woods, nestled between thick trees and a small creek. The closest town was over an hour away, and the idea of being so far removed from anything familiar felt like the perfect antidote to the noise and stress of everyday life. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already sinking low behind the trees. The cabin was small, built from dark wood, and had a sort of rustic charm to it. The porch had a couple of old rocking chairs, and there was a small woodpile stacked neatly beside the door. The air was crisp, a little chillier than I expected for the season. Still, it was one of those evenings that felt good to be outside, even if just for a little while. Inside the cabin, it was cozy, the kind of warmth that settles into your bones after a long day. There was a fireplace in the living room, a long wooden table, and a couple of worn-out couches. A large window framed a view of the woods, and the only thing I could hear was the occasional creak of the house settling. Perfect. We unpacked our things and everyone started to unwind. Some of us began preparing dinner while others set up for a game of cards. It felt good to be away from everything, and for a while, the idea of spending a couple of days like this seemed like nothing could go wrong. As night fell, we settled around the fire in the living room. The cabin had no electricity, so we used candles for light, their flickering flames casting shadows on the walls. The air grew colder, but the fire kept us warm. The conversation flowed easily at first, laughing, joking, and just enjoying the rare silence of the night. But then, after a while, things started to feel off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about the night felt different. It wasn't anything tangible, just a sensation, a prickling on the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see something moving just outside, but the darkness beyond was still. Nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. At some point, I decided to step outside for a breath of fresh air. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, inhaling deeply as I looked up at the clear sky. The moon was almost full, casting a pale light over the surrounding trees. The night was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I stood there for a few minutes trying to push the unease from my mind, but then I heard it, a faint sound from deep in the woods, just beyond the clearing. It was hard to describe at first, like a faint, muffled rustling, the kind you might hear when a large animal is moving through the underbrush. But it wasn't just one rustle, it was consistent, as if something was moving toward the cabin, carefully, deliberately. My heart rate sped up. I listened harder, trying to figure out what it was. There were no animals I knew of that would be out this close to the cabin, at least not at this hour. I didn't know much about the area, but I had a gut feeling that whatever it wasn't something I wanted to mess with. I took a deep breath and turned back to the door, about to head inside, when I heard something else. This time it was louder, a soft thud, followed by another. I froze. Something was out there. My eyes scanned the darkness, my mind racing as I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer or a bear, something harmless. But the thuds were getting closer, deliberate, too close. I hurried back inside, closing the door behind me, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. The others were still sitting around the fire, talking quietly. I didn't say anything at first, just sat down and tried to act normal. But the unease in the air was thick now. It felt like the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The next couple of hours passed slowly. We ate dinner and played a few rounds of cards, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had heard outside. I was on edge, glancing toward the window every few seconds, half expecting to see something, or someone, moving through the trees. The night felt heavy, as if it was pressing in on us from all sides. Around midnight, we all started heading to bed. The others seemed content to call it a night, but I wasn't sure I could sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the sounds I'd heard, the thuds in the dark, growing louder. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid, but I couldn't help it. I lay in bed, the sound of the wind outside the only thing I could hear now. It was the kind of wind that makes the trees creak and groan, a constant, low sound that filled the silence. It wasn't long before I drifted off, but my sleep wasn't peaceful. I kept waking up, half sure I could hear something moving just outside my window. At one point, I even thought I saw a shadow flicker past the window, but when I looked again, nothing was there. When morning finally came, I was exhausted. The sun had barely risen, and the cabin was still dark. The others were already up, making breakfast. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened the night before. They'd probably just laugh it off as nerves or my imagination running wild. Still, I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting to see something standing just beyond the trees, watching. It wasn't until later in the day that we noticed something odd. The front door of the cabin had been left slightly ajar. None of us had opened it after we went to bed the night before, and I was certain that I had locked it before going to bed. But there it was, hanging open, just wide enough for someone, or something, to slip inside unnoticed. I didn't say anything at first, but the others started noticing too. It was strange, unsettling. I walked around the cabin, checking the windows and doors, but everything else seemed fine. Nothing appeared out of place, yet the door was open, as if someone had been there during the night. We spent the rest of the day keeping a close watch, but whatever had been out there the night before never revealed itself again. The unease remained, though. I couldn't stop feeling like we were being watched. The woods seemed too still, too quiet. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. By the time night came again, I was too anxious to go to bed. I sat up in the living room with one of my friends, watching the fire flicker and crackle. The wind outside had picked up again, and the trees were swaying in the breeze. It was almost peaceful, except for that lingering feeling that something was wrong. We took turns standing guard at the window, peering into the darkness. Every now and then, I thought I saw something, just a glimpse of movement, a flash of something out of the corner of my eye. But each time I looked again, there was nothing. The hours passed, but nothing happened. No more thuds, no more shadows. By the time I finally crawled into bed, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. The sense of being watched didn't go away, but I was too tired to keep worrying about it. The next morning, we packed up and left. As we drove away from the cabin, I looked back at the trees one last time. For the first time since we arrived, I felt like I could breathe again, the weight lifting off my chest as we made our way down the road, leaving the woods behind. We never did figure out who or what was outside the cabin that night, but it didn't matter. I was just glad to be far away from there. And as we drove further from the cabin, I realized that sometimes the woods don't just give you peace and quiet. Sometimes they give you something far more unsettling. Something you don't fully understand but feel deep in your gut. Something you don't ever want to encounter again.